In September of 2022, I released the first complete game I'd ever made onto Steam. In some ways, this was the end of a long journey I'd undertaken for over 10 years towards finally finishing a game and releasing it. For my initial announcement that I would be releasing the game, I made a video discussing, in very general terms, my inspiration for making games, but I'd like to get more specific today. I want to talk about that journey, starting from the very beginning. So let's get into that. I was in elementary school at a critical time in the development of computer science fields, around the start of the learn to code boom. Probably the most notable tool for absolute beginners in this space was, and still is, Scratch. For those with no experience coding, writing code on a traditional IDE can seem daunting, or at least difficult to make anything exciting in. Scratch is meant to make approaching that challenge far less daunting, as instead of typing out lines of code, you drag and drop blocks that do certain things. The express purpose of Scratch is to build games, so things like rendering, input, and even sharing games are built into the website to make the experience as streamlined as possible for beginners. Because of all the extra overhead from the visual language and web-based editor, Scratch games are limited to a 640 by 480 resolution and a frame rate cap of 30 FPS. While some have managed to make very impressive things within these limitations, most people who use Scratch are kids who are just starting to learn about the process of coding. I was first introduced to Scratch because my elementary school offered an after-school club in the computer lab dedicated to making games using it. It was ran by my regular teacher at the time, so there wasn't anyone particularly qualified at the helm. But even despite that, this was the first opportunity I had to try and make games that were remotely similar to the games I really enjoyed. Since we used the Scratch desktop app rather than the web app, none of my creations from that time are saved to my knowledge. But this was still an important step for me learning, in an abstract sense, how games are made. Over the next several years, I would have lots of ideas for games to make, but I just didn't have the drive or skill to bring them to life. Even if I did have that drive, I still only knew how to use Scratch, so I would have been severely limited by that fact at least. When I was on summer break from middle school and early high school, my parents would usually put me in at least one summer camp for a week out of the summer, just to keep me from staying inside on the computer all day. And for the last couple years, those would mostly be coding camps that used Scratch. While most of the kids were just there to socialize and play games on the Scratch website, I really wanted to make something, and I used these camps as an excuse to dedicate myself to that goal for a week or so. In the last of these summer camps I went to, I ended up releasing something onto the Scratch website, which I called Another Boring Platformer. The name tied in with what little story I included in the game, which was a satire of the uninspired platformers you'd find on Flash game websites, complete with an obviously unreliable narrator that cracks jokes and eventually ends up as an antagonist. In reality, it just ended up being another one of these games, with a thinly veiled attempt at satirizing them. As a game, it's just a painfully simple platformer full of bugs and blatantly stolen music from other games. If you're interested in playing it for some reason, the game is still available on the Scratch website and is linked in the description. I wanted to expand upon this game past what I built during that week the camp took place over, which you may be able to tell given what little content there is after getting the double jump. I ran into bugs that I didn't understand how to fix, so I dropped it quickly, but I had a lot of concepts for future power-ups and platforming gimmicks that I could add. One particular mechanic that I had been considering building a game around in those aforementioned ideas I had over the years was having red and green level terrain, and allowing the player to switch between two states that would allow them to interact with one color and not the other. This mechanic may sound familiar to you, but I'll touch on that later. When I ran into issues expanding upon the game, I realized that it may be a good idea to learn a better engine for anything I would make in the future. I had tried before by getting the free version of Game Maker Studio 1.4 on Steam, and I figured that would be the best thing to try again, so I watched a few different tutorials and started toying around with things. While I tried a few different prototypes of different ideas for a few months, eventually I landed on an idea that I figured would be realistic to create, and sometime in the first couple weeks of 2019, I created the project file that would eventually grow to become the top. I initially had a very different concept for this game, which can be seen in the first few prototypes I made for it. While the game as it released is clearly and heavily influenced by Celeste, my idea for the game at this very early stage in development was more so influenced by Hollow Knight, at least in terms of gameplay. Instead of the game being a linear precision platformer, I wanted to make a Metroidvania set in and around this mountain. I got as far as implementing the melee swing and one simple bat enemy before realizing that this concept would be far too much work and far beyond what I was capable of artistically. Designing enemies and characters would have been the most difficult part of development, and it was definitely the thing that killed my motivation to keep going forward with that idea. At this point, I start to get into minor spoilers for early surprises in the final game, so keep that in mind if you haven't played it yet. I still liked the story possibilities that the mountain provided, so moving forward I kept that and dropped anything that remained of the combat system. It was at this point that I tried to implement that switch mechanic that I had been considering for so long, and made a level pushing the mechanic to its limits in terms of difficulty. It worked perfectly, so I decided that a precision platformer built around this mechanic would be the gameplay style I would go ahead with. It was now time to start building levels that would make it into the final product by building the tutorial. The design of the introductory levels was important to get right, as it is with the intro to any game or any story. The thing I designed for above all, similarly to my writing in general, is brevity. I want to explore ideas just enough to be satisfying, and not much further than that in order to keep a good pace, which was a principle I carried throughout the design process for the game. For instance, the first level is designed to get players acclimated to almost every mechanic they'll need to be aware of to succeed in the game in as short a time as possible. Showing controls is the easy part, but there are two basic mechanics in the game that don't correspond to any specific controls: ledge grabbing and wall jumping. The former is introduced through this ledge, which is too high to jump up to, and also unlikely to be accidentally wall jumped off, which silently shows that the player character will grab ledges like this if you fall past them. Sliding and jumping off walls is much simpler. Just giving a wall that needs to be scaled, along with an image depicting the sliding action, is clear enough to communicate this mechanic effectively. With that, the player is aware of every basic mechanic that they will need for the rest of the game, without requiring pop-up tutorials that exhaustively explain everything about the game. The following level is something of a competency test for the first level's lessons, while the rest of the first area is devoted to the switch mechanic, which is a good segue into talking about things other than gameplay. An important realization I had in moving from the more combat-centered system to the platforming-centered system is that it was vitally important to work within my means if I was to actually finish and release this game. This meant that I was very limited in terms of visuals and audio, and I solved these two in very different ways. I'll get to audio later, but for visuals, I decided on a limited color palette even before the genre switch, because I knew I couldn't deal with the overwhelming number of options that a full RGB color palette provided. While it is technically a limitation, it was enormously helpful for me to only have to deal with 4 colors at any one time. But then there's the switch blocks which break that color palette. The simple effect of fading between black and white was more so born out of a necessity to make these blocks stand out, since they are consistently the most important parts of the levels that include them. This solution only had one potential issue: how would it fit in with the story? I had to contextualize the break in art style through the story, which for now is done through ambiguity. It was a conscious choice to leave much of the story ambiguous at this point, which I hoped might give players an additional reason to continue the game on top of hopefully enjoyable gameplay. After the switch mechanic is introduced, and the player is tested on their comprehension of everything up to this point, there's a cutscene where you finally get to see the mountain, and since I gave the game a sort of cold open, without any sort of title screen, this is where I would place the title of the game. Now I had to think of a name, and considering the mountain setting and the vagueness of the story plans I had, I decided to name it To the Top. This is the title I would have went with, though in preparing for release I found that there was already a game on Steam called To the Top, and chopping off the first word was easy enough while still getting the important part of the name. For the rest of this video, I will be calling the game The Top for convenience. At this point, I had a fully playable demo of the tutorial area, so I decided now was the time to really open up the game to some proper playtesting. For a game like this, where death comes easily and levels can be made very precise, hitting the correct balance of difficulty without any playtesting is nearly impossible. As the developer of a game, knowing your game at the level of source code, combined with your knowledge of how you intend players to complete your levels, will inevitably alienate you from the new player experience. While you can compensate for this by making sure levels are very easy, this risks the game's pacing being too fast, which is what I wanted to avoid just as much as a brutally difficult game that moves too slowly. In reality, the only practice that will allow you to hit that balance is frequent playtesting. My practice for playtesting was to get in a call with my playtester and directly watch them play. For a game based on linear levels, making sure that players intuitively understand the correct way to get through those levels is crucial, especially for the top, since the switch blocks introduce a light puzzle element to some levels on top of the precision required. This is why having a direct line to the playtester was helpful for me, because if I noticed that they were missing something in the current level, I could make a note of that and then tell them what my intention for the level was. I had to make sure I didn't constantly backseat, but if it was something I was going to change in a future build, that specific iteration wouldn't need any further playtesting. By using this method, most changes I ended up making were ones that I thought of myself while watching others play the game, but not all of them were. One change that was suggested by one of my playtesters ended up being a very good one, which was to reduce the death transition from a second long black screen down to a half second. It's a small change, but it's one I likely wouldn't have made if it wasn't directly brought up to me, and it helped improve the game's flow a lot. These same playtesting principles also go for parts of levels that are too difficult in terms of pure execution, which is a trickier problem. This is the reason I implemented the assist modes into the game, so that players could adjust aspects of the difficulty to their liking. The assist mode solution is one that I like, because the two main assist modes don't change anything about the game's mechanics. When using these, you're still doing the same things, just at a lower speed or in your own self-defined segments by using save states. Invincibility and level skipping are more so intended for players who absolutely can't deal with the levels and just want to observe the story, which I completely understand and made sure to accommodate for. A quick fun fact here is that when I initially added checkpoints to the game, they were not turned on by default and counted as an assist mode. Enabling them by default was a clean way to smooth out difficulty in longer levels without needing to completely redesign them, while simultaneously creating an additional optional challenge of completing the game without using checkpoints. This is probably the most compelling example of how out of touch you can be as a developer when it comes to the new player experience, and it's why constant playtesting was a huge part of making this game's difficulty curve work. But to get back to the timeline, my next job was to start designing the areas that would make up the body of the experience, the caves and the mountainside. While building the tutorial, I had already decided on the structure of the game, as well as what twists I would make on the gameplay, both the moving objects that move along tracks for the caves, and the strong wind that pushes the player character for the mountainside. Since my focus was on keeping a brisk pace throughout the game, the most important principle of my level design was to never repeat myself. Each level is either introducing a new level element or challenging the player by putting previously introduced level elements into new contexts, with the final 2 to 3 levels of each area acting as comprehension tests. To illustrate this, I'll go through every level in the caves and explicitly state what the purpose of each level was. First, the introductory level is just a single jump, but it introduces the semi-solid platforms that you can jump through. Next is the introduction of the moving platforms, and following that is a simple test of jumping between multiple moving platforms. Then the next level combines the switch blocks and the moving platforms in the simplest possible way, only requiring the player to get on the platform and switch at the right times. The combination of these two elements is expanded upon in the next level while requiring more complex movement. Another introductory level comes next, with the saw blades that act as threats which move along tracks, and the next level uses them to make what is easily the most challenging level in the game thus far. Following that is a very simple introduction to the switch platforms that function just the same as the other switch blocks. The next 2 levels involve exploiting quirks with moving platforms, like using the momentum of a platform to jump higher, or getting a switch platform to move to a place where it's usable. Finally, the last 2 levels are comprehension tests, with the penultimate level using the saws as a time-sensitive obstacle, and the final level combining everything introduced up to this point into a longer level than anything that came before. The design and order of these levels were very important in keeping the difficulty curve smooth and retaining player engagement, and while I could have likely achieved a more smoothed out difficulty curve by introducing more levels in between, this is the best I could do while keeping the pace I aimed for. Before getting into major spoilers for the game, I thought it would be good to go over the solution to my issues with audio. Designing the audio was the main thing I was dreading throughout the development process, and I put it off for about 90% of the active development time because of this. In short, while I can open up an image editor and draw pixel art that I think is good enough to make it into the final game, even if it is very simplistic, creating high-quality music and ambience requires much more specialized tools and knowledge, both of which I don't have. From the time I had finished the initial demo of the tutorial levels, I had already considered and decided on what sort of music would fit the game, which is approximately what is heard in the final product, but these ideas were not feasibly going to be brought to life by me. Luckily for me, I had a friend who had both the tools and knowledge to do just that. I had Nathan playtest the game in December of 2021, and after I expressed my lack of confidence in my ability to compose for the game, he offered to join me on this project as the composer. This potentially saved the game from a silent cancellation, or at the very least greatly increased the quality of the final product. The music itself is a mix of chiptune to fit the strict color palette pixel art aesthetic, and a more mellowed out ambient feel to the melodies that make the songs a bit softer on the ears than chiptune usually is. Overall, the music turned out to be a great complement to both the story and gameplay, and I'm really glad it wasn't done by me because it would have sounded much worse. But seriously, Nathan's music brought a life to the game's world that is as close to my ideal vision for the game as I could have ever hoped for, and it really completes the game's tone in that way only music is capable of. Major spoilers begin here. I would really suggest you try the game if what you've seen so far interests you, because at this point I'll be getting into all the late game surprises. With a tutorial area of 5 levels and 2 full areas of 12, that makes a total of 29 levels in the game, but looking at the store page, it claims that there are actually 50 levels in total. It's at this point where several aspects of the game merge together, and in order to go over all of them, I'll have to go one by one. So to start, ideally at some point, players will notice something in one of 3 levels across the 3 areas, whether it be some missing spikes on a wall, or what might look like another exit from the level. Each of these secrets give maps to a secret exit in a different level, each of which will lead to 3 difficult secret levels that expand further upon the lessons taught in the area they're found in. Once you find and complete all 3 secrets, a final full-length area of 12 additional levels is opened up upon reaching what was previously the ending of the game. The 9 secret levels, plus the 12 additional levels in this final area, bring the final level count to a nice round 50, which was to some degree a happy accident. An important part of designing the secrets was getting players to be aware of the hints existing in the first place, while not making it too obvious where they can be found. With this in mind, I placed a hint here in the caves, which was found by several of my playtesters on their first playthroughs, so I consider that a success. Other than that, I just had to hope at least a few people would take the time to find the secrets in the first place, which did end up happening on release, thankfully. The visual design of the secret levels is meant to be the first big late-game surprise, as they completely break the strict color palette art style in a way that ties in very closely to the story. I find breaking art styles to be a very powerful storytelling tool in very specific contexts, and I wrote the game's story specifically to take full advantage of it. I don't want to go too deep into story content as a commitment to my philosophy on authorial intent in art, but I will say that the style of narrative was chosen for the aforementioned compatibility with the breaking art style, as well as the simplicity in writing it aloud. I only had to write lines for one character who usually speaks in a very direct manner, which was helpful since I hadn't written any sort of fiction in years, much less this sort of monologue style for a video game. Despite the simplicity, I still find the story to be a success, and writing the story was probably my favorite part of development, despite being a relatively minor part of it. Another part of the art style break that occurs in the secret levels is communicated musically, as the songs which play in the secret areas are piano arrangements of their chiptune counterparts. This added complexity on the composing side since chiptune and solo piano are 2 totally different styles of music, but it was overall an important addition to sell the contrast between the normal and secret areas, while still relating the secret areas to the rest of the game. I also figured it would be helpful to implement a leitmotif somewhere in the game. While we played around with including one in all the tracks, that ended up being another heavy limitation on the already limited chiptune pieces, so instead the game's leitmotif appears for the credits, the cutscenes at the end of the secret areas, and the secret ending. This worked out very well in not being too overbearing while still being noticeable, as well as enhancing the emotional payoff of these moments. The final thing to briefly talk about in the top is its final area. I wanted this last section to be a surprise shift in many aspects of the game, most obviously by using an entirely different color palette to the rest of the game. But in addition to this, the feel of the gameplay takes a more intense turn, with the introduction of the moving lava acting as a constant threat to be managed alongside the switch blocks. To match this, the intensity of the music also takes several steps up, also taking on more modern synth instruments, as any pretenses of a consistent art style throughout the game are shattered at this point. This entire section was inevitably going to be a step up in difficulty from the rest of the game, even more so than the secret levels, simply due to the additional threat posed by the lava. The later levels required lots of tweaks and nerfs in difficulty, but once I arrived at designs that I thought struck that balance, the game was finally content complete. The final month or two of development was spent almost solely on the game's technical side, fixing bugs and implementing quality of life features. With Nathan's programming experience, we were able to implement more accessibility features like high contrast and colorblind filters, as well as the ability to both use and create entirely new palettes after reaching the secret ending. While the game would need a few patches in the days and months after release, it was at this point that the game felt complete, and it was time to announce that it even existed in the first place. And that brings us to the current day. As much as I would love to say that the release of this game was life-changing, and I now have the funds and knowledge to do full-time game development, that's obviously not the case. But at the same time, that wasn't exactly my goal with making this game in the first place. I'm not struggling financially, and I wasn't looking for a perfect return on my investment in terms of both time and what little money I actually used. Above all, I wanted two things. I wanted to release something onto a big storefront like Steam for purchase, which was obviously a success. But more than that, I just wanted however many or however few people that played the game to enjoy their time with it. Based on comments I've received and the few Steam reviews that have been posted, I'm also willing to call this a success. So I'm very happy with how the top turned out in the end, as it hit my modest markers for success perfectly. Thanks to everyone who has played the game, given feedback, and helped to make the game what it is today. That's the end of my story for now, but we'll see what happens from here.